It began with rain, thick, endless and heavy with the smell of ash and wet earth. The kind of storm that made the roads in Derry Hollow disappear beneath sludge and shadow. Just off the main stretch, at the edge of the Wensley estate, the ground had begun to give, cracking open the southern slope of the family cemetery. That was the official reason given for the exhumation. Landslide risk. Safety protocols, nothing more. But everyone in town knew better. They said Nathaniel Wensley's ghost wouldn't rest. The Wensleys had always stirred talk in these parts. Wealthy, private, unyielding. When Nathaniel died in 1932, barely 45, of stomach ulcers, they said, the funeral was closed, swift and mostly silent. Annabel Wensley, his young widow, had stood stone-faced by the coffin, her gloved hand resting atop the lid like she was sealing a vault rather than mourning a man. No tears, no trembling, just silence. 1 year later, the lid came off again. A team of county officials, flanked by lawyers and 2 grim-faced undertakers, gathered beneath umbrellas and gas lanterns. The earth had shifted just enough to expose part of the casket. It was still intact somehow, though the wood bore the dark bruises of water and time. A crow cawed from a branch overhead as the coffin was eased open. Everyone braced for decay, the sour stench of death long settled. But what they found was something else. The body, yes. Decomposed as expected, collapsed in the tailored suit he had once worn to town council meetings. Bones where cheeks had once been, the dull glint of his wedding band, still looped around bone and rot. But there, nestled beside him, was something no one could explain. Wrapped tightly in oilcloth and bound in silk lace, aged but oddly untouched by moisture, was a small leather journal. The initials embossed in gold leaf were unmistakable, A.W. Annabel Wensley. A hush fell as the bundle was lifted out, slowly, reverently, as though it might crumble or combust. One of the lawyers, a young man named Grayson Hale, stepped forward and unwrapped the first layer, revealing the book's cover. Its edges were worn, but the leather held firm. The air around them seemed to shift, colder, heavier. He opened the journal. Inside were pages of delicate handwriting, looping and precise. The ink had not run. It had survived. He read the first line aloud, almost without meaning to. February 13th, 1932, he will sleep tomorrow. Tonight I write without fear. The men around him stared. No one moved. Somewhere nearby, thunder cracked. This was no keepsake. This was a confession. And just like that, the past stirred. If you're drawn into mysterious pasts and secrets buried with the dead, subscribe now for more gripping stories like this one. There are truths the earth cannot hide forever. In the days that followed, word of the journal spread. Quietly at first, like a sickness, then faster, more fevered. People talked about the Wensley curse, about the look in Annabel's eyes the day she walked away from the burial, dry-faced and free. Some said the journal would prove murder. Others believed it was a love letter, sealed away in sorrow. A few, the oldest ones, whispered that the Wensleys were never meant to rest easy, that their sins ran deeper than coffins could bury. But none of them, not even Grayson Hale, were prepared for what the pages truly held. The first entries painted a portrait of a house that smiled in public and screamed behind closed doors, of a marriage that rotted quietly like fruit beneath snow, and of a woman who wrote not to remember but to survive. The journal had begun. The dead had spoken. And Annabel Wensley, wherever she was, had finally let her story breathe. Annabel Wensley had not spoken in public since the funeral. The townspeople noticed. They always noticed. In Derry Hollow, silence drew attention faster than screams, and Annabel's silence was nearly sacred, impenetrable, enigmatic and sharp-edged. She walked through the village once a month, always alone, her posture straight, her gloved hands folded at her waist. Never idle chatter, never a word of complaint or sorrow. She was dressed in deep blue, not black, and wore no veil over her pale face. The widows whispered. She wasn't mourning, she was watching. Some called it grace, others called it guilt. In the year following Nathaniel Wensley's burial, rumors curled like smoke around the estate. No staff came or left. The windows remained shuttered. There were no visitors. But groceries arrived weekly. Annabel's handwriting marked the invoices, always precise, always signed at the bottom. A.W. She was alive, and yet not quite living. One morning in March, just weeks after the journal's discovery, a young girl named Maggie, daughter of the town seamstress, returned from delivering linens to the Wensley gate. She told her mother that she'd seen Annabel through a window, standing perfectly still in the parlor, staring at a clock that had not ticked in years. She was smiling, the child whispered, but not in a nice way. The story spread like wildfire, and like all fires in small towns, it fed itself. Some believed she had poisoned him, others that she was cursed. A few, bolder in their contempt, called her a witch who had traded her husband's life for her own freedom. Yet none could say they'd seen her cry, not even at the grave. Especially not at the grave. When the journal surfaced, many expected Annabel to contest its release. After all, it bore her name. But no letter came. No lawyer appeared. It was as if she'd vanished into the very soil. Grayson Hale, the legal assistant who'd first unwrapped the journal, found himself sleepless. He'd returned to the office late one evening, pages spread before him under lamplight. He reread the first hymn she'd written, a delicate line of verse written in February 1932. And though the bells may toll for thee, I cast no stone, I plant no tree. For silence is the only vow a widow dares to make, and how? It was strange, almost beautiful, a funeral hymn that sounded more like a lullaby. Yet something about the tone clung to him. The words didn't mourn, they marked. The journal did not begin with rage. It did not begin with accusation. It began with observation. Patterns of footsteps in the hall, the sound of drawers opening when no one should be home, a sudden change in the air when Nathaniel entered the room. Annabel's voice in the journal was not loud. It was measured, cold even, but not bitter. She was not a woman begging to be heard. She was documenting, recording, building a case that no one would read until long after she was free. And that chilled Grayson more than any murder plot might have, because it meant she'd been planning, preparing, waiting. She had never spoken to the town. But now, through the leather-bound relic hidden beside her husband's corpse, she spoke. Her story wasn't just written. It had been sealed beside the man who kept her silent, and the more they read, the more it became clear. This was not about love or grief or even vengeance. This was about truth, and truth, in Derry Hollow, was a dangerous thing. The journal did not begin with fire, it began with a garden. In the spring of 1927, the Wensley estate was alive with roses. White ones mostly, lining the path from the front gate to the veranda. They were Nathaniel's favorite. Annabel had written about them, how the scent clung to her clothes, how the petals bruised under heavy rain, how Nathaniel had once said, "Perfection lies in things that bleed easily." That was before the war between them began. Back then she was Annabel Moore, 29, clever, sharp with numbers, and too proud to marry for anything but love. Nathaniel had courted her slowly, persistently, with flowers and poetry and long, confident letters. He had charm, yes, and presence. He knew how to fill a room with ease. But what drew her most was his promise, a life without fear. The estate in Derry Hollow was their beginning. 3 floors of carved wood, leaded glass and imported wallpaper from France. He had it cleaned and painted before their wedding, and on the morning she arrived, the house smelled like lemon oil and lilacs. The first year was quiet, even happy. Annabel hosted luncheons, took up embroidery, and rode into town every Wednesday. Nathaniel read in the study, met with clients in the drawing room, and insisted they dine by candlelight every night, no matter how tired they were. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the air in the house changed. She wrote, "He began counting things. Glasses in the cupboard, steps between rooms, how many times I spoke at dinner. It started as quirks, then habits, then rules. You forgot the second napkin," he would say without raising his voice, and guests noticed that. "You were gone 13 minutes longer than usual. That makes people wonder. 3 is a sacred number, never 2, never 4. Annabel laughed the first time. The second, she paused. By the third, she stopped laughing altogether. His touch remained gentle, but only when others were watching. In private, he moved her like furniture, not cruelly, just deliberately. There was no shouting, no bruises, but a slow, eroding precision. He corrected how she poured tea. He rewrote her thank-you notes. He stood over her while she combed her hair. And always, always, he reminded her of what she owed him. "My name," he whispered once in bed, "is the only reason they listen to you." Annabel began writing again. Not letters, not poems, just notes, thoughts, observations, little entries on scraps of paper hidden beneath floorboards and inside hollow books. And when those weren't enough, she stitched a leather-bound journal and hid it behind the loose panel in the wardrobe. Her words grew more cautious as the months passed, not fearful, not yet, but wary. She documented his moods, his obsessions, his growing rigidity. She never accused, she never condemned, she only recorded. In one entry from December 1927, she wrote, "He moves through the house as though it's already a mausoleum, and he is its keeper." By early 1928, the roses had started to die. She tried to replant them. Nathaniel forbade it. "Let them wither," he said. "They were only ever a distraction." When she objected, he gave her a look she would remember for the rest of her life. Calm, unblinking, final. That winter, the front path remained bare. The guests stopped coming. The windows stayed shut. And Annabel, for the first time, felt the ache of a silence she had not chosen. She wrote in the journal, "There are wars you do not see until you're already in them. I did not know the first shot had been fired. I only knew that something precious was leaving me, and I could not stop it." Annabel had always imagined children laughing in the Wensley halls. She wrote once that she pictured small shoes by the doorway, the sound of footsteps scampering up the grand staircase, the scent of warm milk and lavender soap drifting through the nursery. These were her quiet dreams, never spoken, never demanded, just hoped for. In the summer of 1929, she carried those hopes inside her. She found out on a morning soaked in dew, her fingers trembling over the letter from the doctor. "You are with child," it read in soft, formal print. Her heart beat louder than it had in years. She hid the letter in the drawer beneath her undergarments and sat for an hour staring at the roses, which had begun to regrow near the fence, wild and disobedient. She told Nathaniel that evening. He didn't smile. Not at first. His eyes narrowed, calculating, then widened, not with joy but with something else. Expectation. "When?" he asked, voice flat. 7 weeks, perhaps 8, she answered. He nodded once, then rose from his chair and walked into the study. She heard drawers opening, a pen scratching paper. When he returned, he held a page of names, boys' names, all beginning with N. "Nathaniel, Neville, Nolan, Norwood. We will carry the line forward," he said. "He must bear our strength." She asked what if it was a girl. His eyes locked onto hers, cold and still. "It won't be." He began ordering furniture the next day, repainting the nursery in blue. He sent a letter to his mother, Clara, inviting her to stay for the last trimester. Annabel hadn't spoken to Clara in nearly 2 years. The woman despised her, quietly but thoroughly. "She will prepare you," Nathaniel said, "for what you must become." What followed were weeks of supervision, inspection, control. Clara arrived with trunks of herbal tinctures, faded Catholic medals and instructions written in Latin. She criticized Annabel's posture, her appetite, the sound of her breathing. At night she left small sachets of herbs beneath Annabel's pillow and whispered prayers in the hallway. Nathaniel encouraged it. "She knows what's right. Listen to her." Annabel retreated into herself, into her journal. She wrote, "It feels like I'm disappearing one cell at a time. Like I'm being rewritten into something I never wanted to be. Not a mother, a vessel." By October, the pain started. It wasn't dramatic. No screams, no sudden collapse. Just a constant ache, a weight that wouldn't lift, a pressure that grew like a second heartbeat. The doctor called it stress. Clara called it weakness. On November 4th, 1929, alone in the washroom, Annabel miscarried. She said nothing. She cleaned the floor, buried the remnants in the garden beneath the old maple, and locked herself in her bedroom for 3 days. When she emerged, pale and silent, Nathaniel was waiting in the hallway. He looked at her stomach, then at her face. "You lost it," he said, not as a question but a verdict. She nodded. He said nothing more, just turned and walked away. Clara left the next morning. No funeral, no name, no mourning cloth hung from the windows. The child simply never was. And yet, the weight remained. Annabel stopped leaving the house. She stopped speaking at dinner. When Nathaniel looked at her, he saw not a wife but a reminder of failure. The meals became colder, the conversations fewer, the silences heavier. Rumors began in town that she had been ill, that Nathaniel had sent her away for treatment, that she had tried to harm herself. None of it was true. But the lies suited Nathaniel more than the truth. In her journal she wrote, "They will never know what I buried, only that something vanished in me, and that I never smiled the same again." Clara Wensley returned to the house in early 1930, uninvited. Annabel woke to the sound of her voice in the hallway, clipped and formal, speaking to Nathaniel as though no time had passed. She carried no luggage, only a black leather case and a crucifix around her neck that swung like a pendulum when she walked. She kissed her son once, coldly, then moved into the east wing, the chamber that had once belonged to Nathaniel's father before he hanged himself. Annabel had not entered that room in years. Nathaniel gave no explanation, only said, "She's here to help you." Clara wasted no time. By the second day, she had reorganized the linen closet, rearranged the spice rack, and thrown away all of Annabel's lavender soap. "Too soft," she said. "It makes the mind dull." She brought out her rituals again, bundles of sage, ash circles near the doors, and tiny bowls of salt left beneath the beds. She spoke in hushed Latin to the windows, claimed she could see things others could not. Annabel stayed silent, but her journal did not. "She believes I am infected," she wrote, "not with illness, with unworthiness." Meals became prayers. Sleep became fasting. Clara insisted Annabel rise before dawn to recite from a cracked leather Bible, page after page of ancient psalms written in blood and fire. "The womb must be purified," Clara said over her tea. "Your soul is not clean." Nathaniel sat beside her, silent, unmoving, neither endorsing nor objecting. That was his way, letting the decisions fall like stones, then blaming gravity. One night, Clara followed Annabel to her bedroom. She waited until the door was nearly closed, then placed her hand on the frame and said, "I saw the blood you buried." Annabel froze. "I dreamed it, and dreams from the righteous do not lie." She smiled then, not kindly. "The child was not strong. That is why it was taken." Annabel said nothing. But in her journal she wrote, "This is not madness, this is calculation. A slow poison disguised as penance." She began hiding food in drawers. The fasting made her dizzy. She stopped attending the dawn prayers. She feigned sleep when Clara chanted. But still the old woman moved through the house like smoke, seeping into every crack, watching, waiting. One morning, Annabel found her journal missing. She tore the bedroom apart. Every panel, every drawer. She searched the sitting room, the sewing cabinet, the underside of the sofa. Nothing. Her heart thundered. That book held everything. Her thoughts, her truths, her slow unraveling. Without it, she was a silence again, shapeless, voiceless. That night, Clara served dinner alone. Nathaniel was away, gone to a meeting in Harrisburg. They ate in silence. The roast was dry, the wine sour. When the plates were cleared, Clara stood and retrieved something from the mantel, the journal, unharmed, untouched. She set it on the table. "I read it," she said. Annabel's fingers twitched. "You are clever, careful, dangerous." Clara sat. "But you do not frighten me." She leaned closer. "He made you too strong. You were supposed to break." She rose and left, leaving the journal behind like a warning. Annabel did not sleep that night. She did not write in the journal, not then. She simply opened it, ran her fingers over the pages, and memorized every word she'd once written. The next morning, Clara's door remained shut, the east wing silent. Annabel never saw her kneel again at the windows, but she began writing again, and this time she made 2 copies. There was a small garden behind the Wensley home, tucked between the greenhouse and the northern wall of the estate. Once it had been filled with herbs and seasonal blooms, tended by a hired gardener who whistled softly as he worked. But after the miscarriage, Nathaniel let the place go to ruin. He said the soil had been spoiled by what was buried beneath it. Annabel never asked what he meant. By the spring of 1931, the garden was little more than tangled weeds and broken pots. The iron gate rusted shut. The path to the greenhouse was choked with vines. Then Elias arrived. He was hired on a Thursday. No warning. No introduction. Just a lean, sun-darkened man in his 40s with rough hands and kind eyes. Nathaniel brought him in to restore the estate's dignity. That was the phrase he used at dinner, cutting his meat in perfect squares while Annabel stared across the table. Elias nodded when introduced, hat in hand. He didn't speak unless spoken to. But Annabel noticed the way he looked at the garden, not with disdain but with curiosity, as if he could see something growing there others had long forgotten. The next morning, she found him pulling weeds behind the greenhouse, sleeves rolled, humming to himself. She didn't say a word. He nodded once and kept working. For the first time in months, she walked beyond the patio. She wrote, "There is life here, strangled but not dead." Over the following weeks, the garden began to shift. Bit by bit, the path cleared, the gate oiled, the greenhouse glass washed clean. Elias never asked for help, but he never refused it either. One morning she brought him a basket of lemon scones and left it by the tool shed. The next day he returned the basket with a small note inside. "The soil's not ruined, just tired." She smiled for the first time in months. In the journal, her handwriting changed. It grew lighter, looser. She described the scent of mint returning, the first bud of a camellia breaking through. She didn't write about Nathaniel at all. Elias never came inside the house. He worked from sunrise to dusk, resting under the shade when the heat grew thick. Sometimes Annabel would sit nearby with a book, pretending to read. They rarely spoke, and yet each silence between them felt different from the others in her life. One afternoon she asked about his past. He said only, "Had a wife once, she grew tired of waiting." Annabel didn't ask for more. And he didn't offer. But in her journal she wrote, "He doesn't see me as broken, he doesn't try to fix me either." The roses at the edge of the garden began to return, wild, unruly, crimson instead of white. Nathaniel noticed. At dinner he remarked, "I thought I told him not to waste time on those bushes." Annabel replied, "You didn't. And even if you had, they've grown without your permission." Nathaniel paused, knife in hand, eyes dark. Then he smiled. "You're spending too much time in the sun," he said. "It's making you bold." But she didn't look away. Later that night, she added a second section to her journal, tucked behind a sewn-in page, a place for moments that didn't belong in the main narrative. Things too small, too soft, too precious to risk discovery. In it, she wrote about Elias's laugh, the way he cradled sprouting vines like secrets, how his voice reminded her of thunder just before rain. She called it the quiet pages. And in those pages, she allowed herself to feel again, not hope, not yet, but the possibility of it. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, just after a thunderstorm had rolled across the valley. The air was thick, the sky yellow-grey. Annabel was in the parlor, needlepoint resting in her lap, when the sound came, not of thunder, but of glass and canvas splitting down the middle. The portrait of the Wensley patriarch had fallen. It had hung in the main hall for nearly 50 years. Nathaniel's grandfather, stern and suited, hands folded, painted eyes watching every guest who crossed the threshold. The lightning hadn't struck the house, but something had shifted. The frame lay crooked, the canvas torn clean down the center. his painted face split between two expressions, pride and scorn. Annabel stared at it for a long time. Nathaniel was called from the study. He stood before the ruined image, face unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned and ordered the servants to burn it. Later she wrote, "He didn't flinch. It was almost a relief to see it broken, as though something long held in place had finally given way." That same week, he fired the housekeeper without cause. Sent 2 maids away with severance pay. Only Elias remained, though Nathaniel now watched him closely, eyes lingering too long at dusk when Elias put away his tools. Annabel noticed the way he gripped his wine glass tighter at dinner, how his hands no longer rested on the table but clutched the chair as if bracing against a tide. On Friday, it broke. Annabel had brought Elias a jar of jam she'd made herself. Strawberry, the kind her mother once canned. She left it near the gate of the garden as she always did. Nathaniel saw it. He said nothing for 2 days. Let the gesture rot in silence. Then, Sunday morning, he called Elias inside. Annabel heard the footsteps, heavy, sharp. She followed quietly, heart thudding. From the top of the stairs, she saw Nathaniel standing in the main hall, arms folded, Elias before him. "What have you been doing out there?" Nathaniel asked. Elias tilted his head. "Working." "With my wife." A pause. "She walks the garden. I work it. Nothing more." Nathaniel stepped closer. "You think I don't see the way she looks at you?" Elias didn't answer. And then Nathaniel struck him. A sharp, sudden blow to the jaw. Elias staggered but did not fall. Blood welled at the corner of his mouth. He looked at Nathaniel, not with fear, but with pity. Annabel gripped the banister. "Get out," Nathaniel said, "before I call the constable." Elias didn't speak. He wiped his mouth, gathered his tools from the porch, and walked down the drive. Annabel did not follow. That night, the silence between her and Nathaniel was deeper than ever. Not angry, not cold, just hollow. She didn't touch her food. He didn't mention Elias. But later, as he stood pouring brandy, he said, "Outsiders rot us. That's why they never last here." She didn't respond. But in her journal she wrote, "The house did not break when Elias left." It cracked when Nathaniel decided kindness was a threat, when he began to fear what he could not control. She returned to the garden the next morning. The roses were still blooming. She knelt in the dirt, hands deep in the soil, and wept. Not for Elias, not for herself, but for the truth she now understood. That the house would never love her back. That the man who owned it had mistaken her silence for surrender, and that her quiet pages were no longer enough. Annabel began writing letters she never intended to send. They started as whispers on paper, short notes to her sister in Boston, whom she hadn't seen in nearly a decade. "Dear Margaret," she'd write, followed by confessions buried so long they felt like fiction. She described the house, the garden, the silence, the bruises that never reached the skin. She told of Elias, of his hands in the earth, of how she remembered what laughter sounded like when he was near. But she never addressed the envelopes, never stamped them. She tucked each one between the pages of her second journal, the one hidden beneath the floorboard in her bedroom closet, where the rug never quite reached. By midsummer, there were 13, each written on pale blue paper, each ending the same way. "I'm still here, but I don't know for how much longer." One morning, while dusting the top shelf of the library, Annabel found something she had never noticed before, a leather-bound volume of family records. It was tucked behind the genealogy of the Wensleys, wedged deep into the shelf. No title on the spine. She opened it out of habit. Inside were names she recognized, Nathaniel's parents, his aunts, uncles, cousins. But as she read further, a gap emerged, a missing line between 2 generations, a name scratched out, a birth certificate altered in another hand. She flipped to the back and found a letter. It was from a woman named Rose Wallace, dated 1891, addressed to Dearest Clara. The handwriting was unmistakable. "I have raised him well. He knows nothing of his mother's illness. I swore to you I would protect the family name, and I have kept that vow. Nathaniel will never know he was not born of your womb." Annabel read the paragraph 3 times before she let herself breathe. Nathaniel had been adopted. The man who obsessed over bloodlines, who policed legacy and purity, had no Wensley blood at all. She sat on the floor, heart racing. For years she'd been told she wasn't good enough, that she didn't belong, that she had tainted the name. And all the while, the very name he worshipped had been built on a lie. She didn't confront him, not yet. Instead, she returned to her journal. He fears corruption, but the rot began long before I arrived. This house is built on secrets, stitched together by women who were never allowed to speak. I will not scream. I will write. She copied the letter from Rose into her journal by hand. Then she burned the original. Nathaniel grew more erratic in the days that followed. He paced at night, muttered in the study, and watched the windows like they were eyes. He accused her of moving his books, of misplacing his ledgers, of tampering with the household accounts. She said nothing. But she kept writing. One night, she found the blue letters scattered across the parlor floor. He had found them. She stood in the doorway, frozen. Nathaniel sat in the chair near the fireplace, one of the letters in his lap, his fingers drumming against the paper. "You write to her?" he asked. "The one who left you behind?" "She didn't leave me," Annabel said. "I left her." He looked up then, eyes dark. "You don't get to leave people, Annabel. Not when you owe them everything." She walked past him without a word, gathered the letters and left the room. That night she added a new entry to the journal. "I no longer fear the storm. I am the thunder now." The winter of 1931 arrived without warning, sudden, sharp and bone-deep. Snow fell in long, unbroken sheets, covering the Wensley estate like a burial shroud. The windows froze from the inside. The pipes groaned. The house grew colder by the hour, no matter how many fires were lit. Annabel stopped writing letters. She wrote only in the journal now, and only at night by candlelight. The world has gone quiet, she noted, but it is not peace. It is the hush before collapse. Nathaniel no longer left the house. He wandered from room to room, shoulders tense, fingers twitching. He rearranged furniture compulsively, cleaned the same glass twice in a row, recited the names of ancestors under his breath as though invoking protection. He accused Annabel of stealing his cufflinks, then apologized the next morning. He shouted about loose floorboards and rotting beams. He insisted someone was poisoning his food, but it was Clara's death that truly changed him. She had returned again without notice, just after the first snowfall, pale, sharp-eyed, thinner than before. Her voice rasped, her steps slow, but she still carried the air of command. She spent most of her days in the East Wing, rereading scriptures and boiling strange roots in water. Annabel heard her chanting once late at night, a string of syllables that didn't belong to any prayer she knew. And then one morning, Clara was gone. They found her seated in the chair by the window, head tilted back, eyes closed. No struggle, no noise. A cup of tea on the table beside her, untouched. The doctor claimed heart failure. Nathaniel accepted it with a nod, but said little else. Annabel stood beside the body, watching the wind curl frost against the glass. She didn't mourn. Not for Clara, not even for what might have been, had she ever been loved by the woman. She felt nothing. And in that emptiness, she realized something terrifying. She was no longer afraid of anyone in that house. Nathaniel refused a public funeral. "She belonged to us," he said. "Not to them." He buried her in the family plot, near the cracked headstone of his grandfather. The soil was too hard, frozen deep. It took hours. Annabel watched from the window, wrapped in a shawl, sipping lukewarm broth. Not once did she blink. In the days after, Nathaniel grew quieter. His pacing slowed, his accusations dulled. He no longer shouted. But his silence was not calm. It was the silence of a man unraveling inward. One night he stood at the top of the stairs and whispered, "Do you see them?" Annabel, seated below, didn't respond. "The eyes," he said, voice trembling. "They're watching from the walls." She didn't move. He descended slowly, one step at a time, like a child afraid of the dark. That evening she wrote, "His mind is collapsing under the weight of lies. and he does not know how to live in a house that no longer obeys him. Snow pressed against the glass. Wind howled through the cracks. The fire burned low. Annabel spent her nights near the hearth, rereading every journal entry from the beginning. The garden lay buried, the greenhouse shattered by ice. The roses, silenced beneath a white sheet. But she remembered them. She remembered Elias's hands, the quiet pages, the sound of her own breath when she still hoped. She did not cry. She did not rage. She simply sharpened her silence and waited, because she knew the house would not survive another spring, and neither would Nathaniel. Annabel began with the wine cellar. It was the only room in the house Nathaniel no longer visited. The cold aggravated his joints, and he claimed the damp reminded him of burial grounds. She descended the narrow stairs once a day, sometimes twice, with a shawl around her shoulders and a key tucked in her sleeve. He never asked what she did down there. She wrote in her journal, "There are places he cannot follow. That is where my future begins." The shelves were still stocked, bottles of deep red Burgundy and old French blends reserved for guests who no longer came. Behind a stack of dust-covered crates, she found the cabinet, locked. She pried it open with a fire poker. Inside were cleaning chemicals, rags, and a small glass bottle with a faded label, arsenic trioxide, a remnant from the gardener, no doubt. For rodents or weeds. She held it in her hand for a long time before placing it in her apron pocket and locking the cellar behind her. Back in her room, she opened the journal, not to confess, but to commit. He took my voice. He took my name. He took the child I carried, but he will not take the rest of me. She wrote not of vengeance, but of clarity, of control, of a plan that would be executed not in rage, but in resolve. She waited a week. She tested the powder in small amounts, watching it dissolve, timing how long it took the tea to turn bitter, then how to mask it with sugar and cloves. She measured exact portions, careful and calm. Not too much, not too fast. It had to look like nature. She practiced her expressions in the mirror. Surprise, grief, concern. But mostly she practiced stillness. On February 12th, she made her final preparations. She burned old pages, the earliest journal entries, ones that served no purpose now. She folded her quiet pages into an envelope and sealed it with wax. She packed a small bag and placed it beneath the floorboard beside the second journal. She looked at herself in the mirror and said aloud, "Tomorrow he will sleep." That night, Nathaniel said nothing over dinner. He was pale, thinner. His eyes sank deeper into his skull, like the house itself had begun to feed on him. He drank his brandy in silence and did not ask where she had been that afternoon. He did not see the change in her, but she saw his decline, and she knew it was time. On the morning of February 13th, she rose early. She prepared a breakfast of toast and jam, eggs with herbs, and a cup of tea laced with the smallest amount, just enough to begin the illusion. Nathaniel barely noticed the flavor. She smiled softly. "You should rest more," she said. He grunted. "Rest is for the dead." She carried the dishes to the kitchen, poured herself a fresh cup and sat by the window watching snow melt from the branches. The garden was still buried, but she knew, beneath the frost, the roses were waiting. That evening she made beef stew, his favorite. She added wine, butter, bay leaves, and something else. He ate slowly, commented on the flavor. She told him she used Clara's old recipe. He laughed. When the bowl was empty, he leaned back in his chair, hand over his stomach. "Too rich," he muttered. She said nothing, only poured him another glass of wine. That night, while he slept, she wrote her final entry. "There are things I will carry, but not him, not anymore." She placed the journal in the drawer. Then she crept to the cellar and hid the bottle behind the bricks. No second thoughts, no turning back. The house was unnaturally quiet that night. The fire hissed low in the hearth, and the clock in the hallway skipped its chime. Annabel moved through the rooms with deliberate calm, checking locks, adjusting curtains, as if preparing the home for a storm she knew had already passed. Nathaniel sat in the dining room, wineglass in hand, staring into the shadows like a man searching for something he had misplaced. "Did you use rosemary?" he asked, voice thick, slow. Annabel nodded. "You said it reminded you of your childhood." He gave a soft grunt, sipped again. "I don't remember saying that." "You did," she said. "On our 2nd anniversary." He leaned back, the chair creaking beneath his weight. His face was pale, a thin sheen of sweat on his brow. He lifted the glass but didn't drink. "I feel strange." She tilted her head just slightly. "Strange how?" "Like the room is tipping." He stood abruptly. The chair scraped harshly against the floor. Annabel watched him sway. His hand clutched the edge of the table for balance. He began, but the words fell apart in his mouth. She rose calmly, walked to his side, placed a hand on his arm. "You need rest," she said gently. "Come, let me help you to bed." He looked at her, eyes wide, not with fear, but confusion. His mouth opened, then closed. A second passed, then 2. Finally, he nodded. She guided him through the hall, slow steps on creaking wood, each movement rehearsed in her mind, measured, certain. The bedroom smelled of cedar and dust. She helped him sit, removed his shoes, pulled the blankets up to his chest. He lay there, still breathing heavily, eyes drifting shut. "I don't want to die," he murmured, not quite to her. Annabel brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. "You won't," she whispered. "Not tonight." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile he used when he thought he'd won an argument. Then sleep took him. She returned to the kitchen, cleaned the dishes, wiped down the counters, poured the remaining stew into the bin, and scrubbed the pot until the scent of rosemary vanished. Then she went to her room, opened the journal, and wrote, "I expected more. More fear, more struggle. But perhaps all tyrants die this way, not with thunder, but with a whimper they don't understand." Hours passed. When she checked on him just before dawn, he hadn't moved. His chest rose, but shallow, his lips pale. The poison worked slowly. She'd studied the doses. This was not cruelty. This was design. 1 more day, 2 at most. The next evening, she returned to his side with a fresh cup of tea. No herbs, no sugar, just heat. He blinked awake, hands trembling. "Why?" he asked. "What did I do?" She sat beside him, placed the cup on the table, folded her hands. "You kept me here," she said. "You made me forget myself." He laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "You were nothing before me." She did not argue. Instead, she leaned close, her voice low, steady. "You were right about the garden," she whispered. "Some things rot from the inside." His breath slowed. He tried to lift his hand, but it fell against the sheet. She rose and walked to the window. Outside, the first green buds had broken through the snow. She watched them for a long time. Behind her, Nathaniel's breathing stopped. She did not turn around. She simply stood there, eyes on the garden, waiting for the sun. Nathaniel Wensley was buried on a Friday. The ground had thawed just enough for the gravediggers to manage, though their boots sank deep with each step. The cemetery was quiet. No hymns, no bells, no eulogy. Annabel insisted on a private burial, attended only by 2 servants, the doctor and the local magistrate. No press, no pastor, just the silence of the dead and the wind in the trees. The official cause, complications from chronic illness. The doctor had found no signs of foul play. No alarms were raised. His decline had been steady, consistent with stress and digestive weakness. And his wife, ever devoted, had cared for him through every stage. Or so the reports would say. Annabel stood beside the grave, hands clasped in front of her, the same dark coat she had worn to Clara's burial pulled tight around her shoulders. Her face betrayed nothing, not grief, not triumph, only composure. The magistrate offered condolences. She nodded, thanked him softly, and asked that the estate affairs be delayed until spring. He agreed, of course, no one questioned her. That afternoon she returned to the empty house. It was colder now without Nathaniel, not in temperature but in spirit. The rooms echoed differently. The air carried less weight, the shadows no longer whispered back. She walked through each hall slowly, brushing her fingers against the banisters, the door frames, the worn velvet chairs. She paused in the study, where his scent still lingered, tobacco and ink. She did not cry. Instead, she dusted the shelves, straightened the ledger, and locked the door behind her. She wrote in her journal that night, "The quiet is real now, not forced, not stolen. It belongs to me." In town, the news spread with restraint. The Wensleys had always commanded respect, and Nathaniel's passing drew polite curiosity, nothing more. A short obituary appeared in the local paper, recounting his years of service to the community and his dedication to legacy. There were whispers, of course, whispers always came. Some claimed Annabel had shown no tears. Others said she wore blue again, not black. One woman swore she saw her laughing by the river 2 days after the burial. But no one dared say it aloud. That perhaps, just perhaps, Nathaniel Wensley's death was a liberation rather than a loss. The house became still. No visitors, no staff, just Annabel and the wind. At night, she lit candles in the parlor and reread the journal from the beginning. She lingered on the early pages, on the soft memories, on the woman she had once been. She folded the letters never sent and tucked them into a single envelope, sealed with wax. Then she walked to the garden. The snow was nearly gone. Beneath the soil, she felt the promise of bloom. She knelt by the old rosebush, now dark and tangled, but still rooted, and placed a single seed beside it. A red camellia, Elias's favorite. She whispered, "For what was lost," and then she turned away, not from sorrow, but from what no longer needed her. The following day, she began drafting her will. Everything would be left to a trust, one designed for women without voice, without power, without safety. She named it after the middle name she never used, Grace. Annabel Grace Wensley. A name he had never spoken aloud. She signed the papers with steady hand and wrote one last line in the margin. "He is gone. I am not." 3 days after the burial, the house was quiet enough to breathe. Annabel walked the halls with new purpose. She no longer stepped lightly, no longer watched for eyes behind doors or paused at creaking floorboards. The silence welcomed her now. The house had shifted. It belonged to her, not in name, not in title, but in spirit. She gathered the journal from the hidden drawer beneath her bed. It was heavier than she remembered, not in weight, but in memory. Every page marked a step, a bruise, a choice. It had not been written in rage or revenge. It had been written in preservation. Her voice, stitched in ink, bound in leather, had survived what she had not dared to speak aloud. She opened to the final entry and read it one last time. "He is gone. I am not." She closed the cover, wrapped the journal in oilcloth and lace, carefully, reverently, tied the knot with fingers that no longer trembled. Then she walked to the dining room and retrieved the silver key to the family crypt. That evening, under a sky that threatened rain, she returned to the cemetery alone. No one saw her pass through the iron gate. No one watched her unlock the stone door. Inside, the air was cold, the walls damp with moss. Nathaniel's casket rested at the far end, mahogany, polished, smug. She stared at it for a long time, not in mourning, not in fear, but in recognition. She knelt, placed the journal inside the velvet-lined hollow beside his body, where a family Bible might have lain, or a photograph, or a token of love. But Annabel left him truth. She pressed her hand against the lid and whispered, "May you finally hear me." Then she sealed the coffin and walked out into the wind. In town, no one noticed her absence that night. By morning she was back at the estate, calm, composed. She dressed in soft grey, combed her hair and resumed her routines, but the journal was no longer with her, and that was by design. Weeks later, she planted a single red rose atop his grave. Just one, fresh, perfect, stolen from the bush that had refused to die. It bloomed in silence. No note, no ribbon, just the color of blood and fire. Some said it was romantic, Others found it unsettling, but all agreed no one had ever seen her cry. She returned to the garden each morning, tended the soil, watered the camellias, spoke to no one. Her hands grew rough again, her back stronger. The servants asked few questions. They knew better. Once the young maid ventured to ask if Annabel wished to redecorate the east wing, now that it stood empty. Annabel replied, "No, let ghosts have their corner." But what lingered there was no longer hers to fear. In the evenings, she sat on the porch, cup of tea in hand, staring out toward the hills beyond the cemetery. Not watching, not waiting, just remembering. Inside, she wrote no more. The second journal, still hidden beneath the floorboard, remained untouched. She did not need to write anymore. The story was where it needed to be, and beneath the earth, next to the man who tried to erase her, her voice pulsed with every turn of the page. A story buried, yes, but not forgotten. Not this time. It began with a dispute over the land. A distant cousin of the Wensley family, a man named Everett Shaw, claimed inheritance rights to a portion of the estate. He arrived with documents, signatures, and a lawyer whose shoes were too polished for Derry Hollow's muddy roads. The matter might have ended with a court appearance and quiet settlement until Everett demanded the verification of Nathaniel's will. And Nathaniel's will, according to Everett, was buried with his pride. Annabel offered no resistance. "If they want to dig up ghosts," she said, "let them." By law, the coffin had to be opened in the presence of an official and a legal representative. Grayson Hale, the same assistant who had first read Annabel's journal a year earlier, returned to the estate, older now, wearier. He did not want to be there. The cemetery was still, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and moss. When they lifted the lid, they found what they expected: decay, dust, the faded remnants of wealth. But then they saw it, the bundle of oilcloth, wrapped in silk lace, pressed into the hollow beside the corpse, the journal. Grayson recognized it instantly. He had thought it gone, destroyed, hidden, lost. Instead, it had been left like a message in a bottle, sealed in silence, waiting. He reached for it, unwrapped it slowly. The leather was still intact. The initials A.W. caught the light. He opened the first page and everything returned. February 13th, 1932, he will sleep tomorrow. Tonight I write without fear. He stood there, heart thudding, as rain began to fall softly on the open grave. No one else understood the weight of what he held. Back at the town office, Grayson read through the journal cover to cover, alone. He turned each page as though touching bone. The entries were not just personal, they were surgical, detailed accounts of control, loss, erasure. But also of resistance, of survival. It wasn't a diary. It was evidence. And yet no law had been broken. The death certificate was signed. The body buried with dignity. There was no crime left to pursue. Still, the journal left a mark. Grayson returned it to the courthouse archive under lock and file, but he made a copy quietly, without permission. Because the voice inside that book did not belong underground, and something in him knew it had to be heard. In town, word spread again, not quickly, but with weight, that the widow's story had not ended with the funeral, that perhaps she'd buried more than a man. And while no one could say what truth lay inside that journal, the whispers grew louder. She hadn't cried. She hadn't mourned. And maybe that was the truest sign of all, that her grief had already passed before the coffin ever closed. The journal was published in fragments, anonymously at first, under the title The Wensley Pages, just a few entries, printed in a small literary magazine in Philadelphia, known for lost voices and regional folklore. The editor called them A Woman's Whispered War. No names, no locations. Just truth, bare and unvarnished. Readers noticed. Then readers demanded more. Soon the full manuscript was released, debated, cited, taught. Some questioned its authenticity, others doubted its morality, but no one could deny its power. Annabel's words resonated not as revenge but as revelation, a portrait of quiet defiance carved over years of silence. She had not needed to shout. She had only needed to be heard. In Derry Hollow, the reaction was muted, embarrassed, defensive. The Wensley name had once stood for power, prestige, lineage. Now it stood for a mirror held too close to the face. The family estate remained empty for a time. Then it was sold, not to relatives, but to a foundation, the Annabel Grace Trust. A shelter was opened in her name 2 counties away, painted in soft greens and cream, with a rose garden behind the kitchen. No portraits hung on the walls, just shelves of books, journals, and ink. Women came and stayed and healed. Grayson Hale never spoke publicly of what he found that day, but he returned once alone and placed a single red flower on the edge of the Wensley grave. Annabel herself was never seen again. No records, no sightings, only rumors. Some said she moved to Maine, changed her name, and opened a bakery near the coast. Others believed she remarried quietly to a schoolteacher and never spoke of her past. But one woman, old, half-blind, and once a maid in the Wensley house, claimed she saw Annabel board a train east just days after the funeral. She carried no suitcase, the woman said, just a book in her hand and peace in her eyes. No one knew if it was true, but everyone wanted it to be, because in the end, her story was not about death. It was about reclamation, about taking back what had been stolen slowly, voice by voice, page by page, and in that taking back she became something more than a widow, more than a name carved in stone. She became the root beneath the rose, the ink that never fades, the silence that outlasts all thunder. And if you listen closely, they say, you can still hear her walking the garden path at dusk, no longer watched, no longer afraid, just free. If you've stayed with this story until the end, thank you. And if you believe stories like Annabel's deserve to be remembered, stories of resistance, of quiet strength, of voices once buried, please subscribe to the channel now. There are more tales waiting to be unearthed. And if you're ready to keep exploring, click the video now appearing on your screen. Another woman's truth waits for you just beyond the silence.